On December 21st, 2012, millions of people watched the calendar with an unease that was difficult to explain. The date had become a symbol, a warning, almost a spell. News segments joked about it. Internet forums obsessed over it. Survivalists prepared. Others laughed, but still checked the sky. Somewhere behind the panic stood an ancient civilization, long gone from its ruined cities, accused of leaving humanity a final message. The Maya, we were told, had predicted the end of the world. But had they? Or had the modern world taken something profound, sacred, and complex and turned it into a countdown? To understand why that date frightened so many people, we have to move slower. We have to step away from the noise of headlines and apocalypse specials and return to a world where time was not a straight road, but a living pattern. Long before 2012 became a modern anxiety, Maya priests, scribes, rulers, and astronomers were studying the heavens with extraordinary patience. They watched Venus rise and vanish. They measured cycles of days that stretched far beyond a single lifetime. They carved dates into stone not because they expected time to stop, but because they believed time had structure, memory, and sacred weight. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because the mystery of December 21st, 2012, is not simply about a failed apocalypse. It is about misunderstanding. It is about fragments of stone, lost books, damaged memory, and a modern culture eager to find doom in another people's calendar. The real question is not why the world ended that day. It is why so many believed it might. The first mistake is imagining the Maya as people staring nervously toward the end. That image belongs more to us than to them. It says something about the modern mind. How quickly we turn ancient knowledge into a warning label, how easily we mistake a calendar for a prophecy, and how often we prefer catastrophe to complexity. The Maya did not build their world around a single final date. They built it around patterns. To enter their world, we have to begin not with apocalypse, but with attention. In the dense lowlands of Mesoamerica, among forests that could swallow entire cities back into green silence, Maya communities created one of the most intellectually sophisticated civilizations of the ancient Americas. Their cities rose with temples, palaces, plazas, causeways, painted walls, reservoirs, ball courts, and carved monuments. These were not random ceremonial centers scattered through the jungle. They were carefully arranged landscapes of power and meaning. A temple was not only a building. A stairway was not only a way to climb. A plaza was not only an open space where people gathered. In the Maya imagination, the city could mirror the cosmos itself. Height mattered, direction mattered, the movement of the sun mattered. The rising and setting of celestial bodies could be woven into architecture, ritual, and royal display. To walk through certain Maya cities was to walk through a designed argument about order, the order of kingship, the order of the heavens, and the fragile order of human life beneath forces much larger than itself. This is why calling the Maya Doomsday prophets is so misleading. It flattens them into a single modern obsession, when their achievements were far broader and stranger in the best sense of the word. They were mathematicians who used the concept of zero. They were scribes who developed a complex writing system. They were astronomers who tracked cycles with remarkable precision. They were artists, engineers, farmers, traders, warriors, diplomats, and storytellers. And beneath these achievements was a way of understanding reality that differed sharply from the way many people today think about time. For much of the modern world, time feels like a line. It begins somewhere behind us, moves through the present, and stretches forward into a future we imagine as open, unknown, and usually irreversible. We measure it, spend it, waste it, save it, lose it. The language itself gives us away. Time becomes a kind of currency. For the Maya, time was not merely something that passed. It carried qualities. It returned in cycles. It had sacred texture. A day was not just a neutral square on a calendar. It could have a character, a burden, a ritual importance. Certain periods were favorable, others dangerous, others charged with obligation. To know time was not only to know when something happened, it was to know what kind of moment one was living inside. That idea can feel alien at first, but even now, we are not as free from it as we pretend. People still treat certain dates as lucky or unlucky. Nations build identity around anniversaries. Families carry grief in particular months. Markets react to cycles. Religions sanctify days. Birthdays, memorials, New Year's, solstices, elections, harvest seasons. All of these remind us that human beings rarely experience time as pure measurement. We load it with memory, fear, hope, and meaning. The Maya took that impulse and developed it into an entire intellectual and ritual system. Their calendars were not decorative curiosities. They helped organize ceremonies, political events, agricultural rhythms, dynastic memory, and mythic history. A ruler could anchor his reign to deep time, linking his authority to gods, ancestors, and cosmic cycles. A ritual could be timed not simply for convenience, but because the day itself mattered. A monument could place a local political event inside a span of time so vast it made the present seem connected to creation. Here is where the story begins to darken slightly, though not because of apocalypse. It darkens because we start to see how much responsibility this worldview placed on human beings. If time was alive with sacred force, then people did not merely live in it passively. They had duties within it. Rituals had to be performed. Offerings had to be made. Kings had to show that they could communicate with gods and ancestors, that they could keep the cosmic order from slipping into danger. The heavens were not a distant backdrop. They were part of a relationship, and relationships can fail. This is one reason Maya monuments can feel so intense. They do not read like casual records. They often speak in the language of power, ceremony, conquest, lineage, and divine connection. Dates are carved with solemn care because dates were part of the claim. A king did not simply say, "I ruled." He positioned himself inside a sacred pattern. He belonged to a sequence. His actions echoed earlier actions and prepared future ones. In that world, astronomy was never just astronomy. The tracking of Venus, the sun, the moon, and other cycles was practical, yes, but it was also theological and political. The sky offered order, but not comfort in the modern sense. It did not say, "Everything will be fine." It said, Everything moves according to pattern, and you had better know where you stand. That distinction matters because it changes how we hear the later story of 2012. Modern apocalypse theories often imagined the Maya as if they were sending a message across time to warn us about one terrible day. But ancient Maya timekeeping was not a cosmic alarm clock left for strangers in the future. It was a living framework for their own world. It helped rulers rule. It helped priests interpret. It helped communities act. It connected the daily to the divine. And it did something even more profound. It made the present feel less isolated. A human life might be brief. A dynasty might rise and fall. Even a great city might eventually be abandoned. But time itself moved through cycles larger than any one generation. The Maya could write dates reaching far into the past and future, not because they imagined time ending soon, but because their sense of time was enormous. That enormous scale is part of what later outsiders misunderstood. When a culture counts in vast cycles, it becomes tempting for another culture to look for a final boundary. We see a great turning point and ask, is this the end? But a turning point is not the same as annihilation. A cycle completing is not the same as existence collapsing. The Maya world was filled with endings, but endings were not empty. A period ending could require ceremony. It could invite renewal. It could be politically useful, spiritually serious, and emotionally powerful. But it did not automatically mean that the sky would split open or the earth would be erased. In fact, the deeper we look, the less the Maya resemble prophets of doom and the more they resemble keepers of pattern. They were not obsessed with the end of time. They were attentive to its movement. That may be more unsettling than the apocalypse story in its own quiet way. A failed doomsday prediction can be laughed off. A sacred calendar asks something harder of us. It asks whether we understand the cycles we live inside. It asks whether we notice what repeats. It asks whether our fear of endings blinds us to the possibility of return. And so, before we can understand why one date in 2012 became famous around the world, we have to understand the machinery beneath the myth. Not the internet myth, not the movie version. The actual calendar system that carried Maya thought across centuries, binding kings, gods, cities, and stars into a single architecture of time. The calendar that frightened the modern world was never one simple calendar. That is part of the problem. When people heard that the Maya calendar ended in 2012, it sounded clean, ominous, and easy to repeat. A calendar ends. The world ends. The sentence almost writes itself. But the Maya did not depend on one single system of counting days, the way most of us glance at a wall calendar or unlock a phone to check the date. They used interlocking cycles, each with its own purpose, rhythm, and sacred meaning. To understand the mistake, imagine not a page turning from December to January, but a set of gears. Some gears are small and turn quickly. Others are enormous and move so slowly that a human lifetime barely notices them. Together, they create a machine of time, not mechanical in the modern cold sense, but alive with ceremony, obligation, and memory. One of the most important Maya cycles was the 260-day sacred calendar, often known by the name Tzolkin. It combined numbers and day names in a repeating sequence, producing dates that carried ritual significance. This was not simply a practical schedule. It was a way of reading the quality of a day, its spiritual weight, its possible dangers and openings. A day could arrive with a kind of personality. Alongside it was a 365-day solar calendar, often called the Hob. This cycle was closer to what we might recognize as a solar year, though it worked according to its own structure. It helped organize seasonal and ceremonial life. But even here, the point was not merely to count agricultural time. The solar year was part of a larger pattern of ritual attention. When these two cycles turned together, they created what scholars call the calendar round, a specific combination of the 260-day and 365-day calendars would not repeat for about 52 years. In human terms, that was powerful. It meant that a date could feel marked by rarity, by return, by the closing of a meaningful span. For many people, 52 years is nearly a lifetime, a cycle that long already gives time a ceremonial gravity. But the 2012 panic did not come mainly from the calendar round. It came from something larger, the long count. The long count was a way of tracking time across vast stretches. It allowed Maya scribes to place events into a deep chronological framework, reaching far beyond the memory of one ruler, one city, or one dynasty. It counted days from a mythic starting point, using units that built upward in scale. At the smaller end was the keen, a single day. 20 keen made a winal. 18 winal made a tun, a period of 360 days. 20 tun made a katun. 20 katun made a baktun, and a baktun was no small thing. It stretched roughly 394 years. This is where the modern imagination began to lean forward. According to the most widely accepted correlation used by scholars, a major long count cycle reached 13 baktuns on December 21st, 2012. The date looked enormous. It had symmetry. It had mystery. It seemed to arrive from a civilization already surrounded, in the popular imagination, by ruined temples and undeciphered secrets. It was exactly the kind of date the modern world knows how to turn into a headline. But here is the essential point. Reaching 13 baktuns was not the same as reaching nothingness. A calendar cycle ending does not mean time itself ends. We understand this perfectly well in ordinary life, but somehow forgot it when looking at the Maya. The end of a year does not imply the destruction of Earth. The end of a century does not mean reality has run out of road. Even the arrival of a millennium, as the year 2000 proved, can produce enormous anxiety without producing cosmic collapse. The Maya long count was capable of imagining dates far beyond 2012. That alone should make us cautious. A system that can count into deep future time is not a system designed to stop dead at one dramatic moment. The notion that the Maya calendar simply ran out is one of those modern myths that survives because it is simple, not because it is accurate. The real meaning of a cycle ending was more subtle. For the Maya, period endings mattered. They could be ritually charged. Rulers commemorated them. Monuments recorded them. Ceremonies marked them. A cycle reaching completion could be a moment of renewal, reflection, offering, or political display. It could say, "The pattern has turned. The order has been maintained. The ruler stands in proper relationship to time and the sacred forces behind it." That is very different from saying, "Everyone should build a bunker." And yet, the misunderstanding was not entirely random. The long count does have a kind of grandeur that invites awe. Its numbers make individual human lives feel very small. When a carved inscription places a royal event inside a timeline stretching back to mythic beginnings, it creates a sensation that history is not merely local. A king's accession, a dedication, a ritual performance. These things become part of a cosmic ledger. The danger comes when we remove that ledger from its culture and read it with our own anxieties. Modern readers often ask ancient calendars to behave like modern predictions. We want them to tell us what will happen. We want a secret code, a warning, a countdown. But the long count was not created to satisfy our appetite for suspense. It was a historical and ritual instrument. It located events in sacred time. It gave structure to memory. It connected earthly authority to cosmic order. There is also something revealing about the phrase, "the calendar ends." It sounds factual, but it hides a choice. Which calendar? In what sense does it end? Does a cycle complete or does time cease? Does an inscription mark a turning point, or does it announce universal destruction? The difference between those questions is the difference between scholarship and sensation usually wins when the story is shorter. By the time December 21st, 2012, entered global pop culture, the technical details had been stripped away. The careful gears of Maya timekeeping were reduced to one ominous clock. The sacred calendar became a movie poster. The long count became a threat. The complexity of a civilization's thought was squeezed into a single modern fear. What if this is the date? That fear had very little to do with what the ancient Maya actually wrote. It had much more to do with how modern people respond to endings. A year ends, and we make resolutions. A century ends, and we look for signs. A millennium ends, and people predict collapse, transformation, judgment, or awakening. Endings have always tempted the human mind. They give shape to uncertainty. They allow private fear to become public drama. They make chaos feel scheduled. This may be why the Maya calendar was so easy to misread. It offered a real cycle, a real ancient system, a real date connected to a real mathematical tradition. The modern world supplied the apocalypse. That does not make the calendar less fascinating. It makes it more fascinating. Because the real story is not that an ancient civilization failed to predict the end of the world. The real story is that their understanding of time was so large, so layered, and so different from ours, that we turned it into something we could recognize. A deadline. The long count did not point to an empty void beyond December 21st, 2012. It pointed to the completion of a vast cycle. And for a civilization that saw time as cyclical, sacred, and alive, completion was never merely an ending. It was a moment when the pattern turned, when the old count gave way to the next, when human beings were asked not to panic, but to pay attention. That is the calendar beneath the myth, not a doomsday machine. A structure of memory, ritual, mathematics, and cosmic order, later mistaken for a fuse burning down to zero. By the time December 21st, 2012 arrived, the date had stopped belonging to the Maya. It belonged to television countdowns, internet forums, paperback prophecies, disaster films, survival kits, late-night jokes, spiritual retreats, and a very profitable cloud of uncertainty. It belonged to people who had never studied a Maya inscription, and to others who had studied just enough to become dangerous at dinner parties. A date once embedded in a complex system of sacred time had been pulled loose, polished into an omen, and passed around the modern world as if it were a warning smuggled out of antiquity. The strange thing is that the panic did not require much evidence. It only required a shape. A great cycle was ending. The number 13 carried dramatic weight in the long count. The date fell near the December solstice. The Maya already occupied a powerful place in the popular imagination. Brilliant, mysterious, ruined, supposedly vanished. Add a few claims about planetary alignment, hidden knowledge, government silence, solar storms, magnetic shifts, and spiritual transformation, and the old calendar became a screen onto which almost anything could be projected. That is how the 13th baktun became an apocalypse. Not all versions of the 2012 story were the same. Some imagined physical destruction, earthquakes, floods, rogue planets, a reversal of Earth's poles, the sun turning violent, the fabric of modern civilization tearing apart. Others were softer, promising not death but awakening, a shift in consciousness, the birth of a new age, the sudden elevation of human awareness. In one version, the world would be smashed. In another, it would be upgraded. Both versions, despite their differences, shared a habit. They treated the ancient Maya as a delivery system for modern longing. For the fearful, the Maya became witnesses against the future. For the hopeful, they became cosmic therapists, gently confirming that humanity was about to evolve. In both cases, the actual civilization was pushed aside. The people who built cities, recorded dynastic histories, made war, farmed difficult landscapes, performed rituals, and preserved complex cycles of time were reduced to a symbolic authority. The Maya predicted it, became a way of making modern anxieties sound ancient. But the older Maya idea of a cycle ending was not so simple. A period ending could matter deeply without meaning that the universe was scheduled for demolition. It could be a threshold, a ritual moment, a time for offerings, dedication, royal performance, or the renewal of order. The completion of a cycle did not erase the world. It marked the turning of time within a sacred pattern. This is a difficult idea for a culture trained to fear deadlines. A deadline is final. It closes possibilities. It creates pressure. Miss it, and something is lost. But a cycle works differently. A cycle returns. It gathers meaning from repetition. It says that endings are real, but not necessarily absolute. The modern apocalypse narrative replaced cyclical time with terminal time. That replacement changed everything. Once the 13th baktun was treated as a final stop, every detail could be made ominous. The date's position in the calendar became proof. The absence of detailed explanation became proof. Damaged inscriptions became proof. Scholarly caution became suspicious. A lack of evidence could even be turned into evidence of concealment. This is one of the quiet engines of conspiracy thinking. Uncertainty does not weaken the story. It feeds it. In that sense, 2012 was not only a misunderstanding of the Maya. It was a mirror held up to the early internet age. The story spread because it was perfectly designed for a fragmented media world. It was visual, ancient, numerical, frightening, and vague enough to survive correction. It could be explained in one sentence, expanded into a documentary, sold on a book cover, argued about in a forum, mocked on television, or woven into spiritual language. It could be apocalyptic or inspirational, scientific sounding or mystical, depending on the audience. And whenever scholars tried to slow the story down, the slower version struggled to compete. The scholarly answer was not as exciting. The 13th baktun marked the completion of an important long count cycle. Ancient Maya evidence for a global apocalypse on that date is extremely thin. Maya concepts of time emphasized renewal and continuity far more than sudden universal destruction. That is a careful answer. It is also a difficult answer to sell between commercials. The end of the world has better marketing. Still, dismissing the 2012 panic as mere silliness would be too easy. People do not become fascinated by apocalypse only because they are gullible. They do it because apocalypse gives form to unease. It turns scattered fears into a single event. Climate anxiety, economic uncertainty, distrust of institutions, technological acceleration, religious expectation, personal dread, all of it can gather around a date. A date makes fear manageable. It says, "Here is when the unknown will reveal itself." December 21st, 2012, became one of those containers. For some, it was a joke. For others, it was a private worry they did not fully admit. For a smaller number, it became a worldview. The approaching date seemed to promise that reality had a hidden schedule, that history was not simply drifting, that behind the noise of modern life there was a pattern older than any government, older than any laboratory, older than any church in the neighborhood. That promise was powerful, but it was not Maya prophecy in the simple sense. The ancient Maya did make predictions of a kind. They read cycles. They linked ritual action to future dates. They projected ceremonies and cosmic anniversaries across time. But this was not fortune-telling in the modern tabloid sense. It was a way of locating human life inside an ordered universe, a universe that required maintenance, interpretation, and ritual care. The difference matters. To say the Maya predicted the end of the world is to turn them into cartoon mystics. To say the Maya understood time through sacred cycles, some of which later outsiders misread as final endings, is less catchy, but much closer to the truth. And the truth carries its own unease, because the 2012 panic reveals how fragile historical memory can be. A complex calendar can become a countdown. A cycle can become a catastrophe. A civilization can become a brand. The more distant a culture seems, the easier it is for outsiders to make it say whatever they already fear or desire. By the morning of December 22nd, 2012, the world was still there. The sun rose. Phones worked. Traffic resumed. The date that had haunted the modern imagination passed into the archive of failed endings, but the misunderstanding did not vanish with it. It left behind a question more interesting than whether the earth would crack open. How did a sophisticated system of sacred time become a global rumor of annihilation? And why, when offered the possibility of renewal, did so many people hear only doom? The answer lies not only in calendars, but in evidence. The few ancient traces that were pulled into the 2012 story, examined, exaggerated, and sometimes forced to carry far more meaning than stone could safely hold. The 2012 story often sounded as if it rested on a library of ancient warnings. In reality, the evidence was far thinner and far more fragile. This is where the mystery becomes quieter, but also more revealing. Not because the stones clearly announce disaster. They do not. The unease comes from something else. The way a few damaged texts, scattered references, and incomplete monuments were made to carry the weight of an entire apocalypse. Ancient history is often built from fragments. A chipped inscription, a broken stairway, a name preserved on one monument and missing from another, a date carved with care, then weathered by rain, roots, war, neglect, and time. The Maya left behind extraordinary written records in stone, ceramics, murals, and books. But what survives is only a portion of what once existed. And when the surviving evidence is incomplete, imagination tends to move into the empty spaces. For the 2012 phenomenon, one of the most discussed pieces of evidence was a monument associated with Tortuguero, a Maya site in what is now Mexico. The inscription is famous because it appears to refer to the completion of the 13th baktun. That alone made it irresistible. Here, at last, seemed to be an ancient text that actually connected the Maya calendar to the date that had captured the modern world. But the problem is not whether the inscription mattered. It did. The problem is what people wanted it to say. The text is damaged. Parts of it are difficult to interpret with certainty. Scholars have debated the precise meaning of some passages, especially where the inscription appears to mention a deity or divine event connected to the period ending. What can be said more cautiously is that the monument refers to a significant calendrical moment. What it does not clearly provide is a prediction of global destruction. That distinction should have slowed the entire 2012 machine. Instead, it accelerated it. Because damaged evidence has a strange public life. To specialists, damage is a warning. Proceed carefully. Do not overstate. Separate what is legible from what is inferred. To popular myth-making, damage can become an invitation. The missing words feel like secrets. The uncertainty feels deliberate. The gaps seem to whisper, even when they are only gaps. This is one reason ancient inscriptions are so vulnerable to sensational interpretation. Stone looks authoritative. A carved date feels harder, older, more serious than a claim in a modern book. When people hear that something is written in stone, they assume certainty. But stone can be broken. It can be removed from context. It can be read badly. It can preserve a sentence while losing the paragraphs around it. A monument is not a complete worldview. It is a surviving witness, and witnesses can be partial. The Tortuguero inscription became famous because it seemed to offer a rare ancient reference to the 13th baktun. But rarity itself is important. If the Maya had truly been obsessed with a coming world-ending catastrophe, we might expect the evidence to be broader, louder, more repeated. We might expect many inscriptions warning of the same disaster, many texts treating the date as a final horizon. That is not what we have. What we have is a small body of material connected to an important cycle ending, surrounded by far larger Maya traditions of recording period endings, royal rituals, mythic time, and cosmic order. In other words, the evidence points toward significance, not annihilation. There is another monument often brought into the conversation, a carved brick from Comalcalco that also appears to preserve a reference connected to the 13th baktun. Like the Tortuguero material, it has been treated by some as though it were a missing page from an end times manual. But again, the more careful reading is less explosive. It shows that such dates could be recorded and anticipated. It does not transform the date into a universal death sentence. This is the pattern again and again. A real clue appears. It is meaningful, but limited. Then the modern story inflates it. The inflation is easy to understand. Human beings are uncomfortable with thin evidence when the subject is emotionally powerful. We want the ancient world either to confirm the legend or destroy it completely. But history often does neither. It leaves us with partial statements, cautious reconstructions, and probabilities instead of cinematic certainty. That can feel unsatisfying. It is also where the honest story lives. The Maya inscriptions were not written for us. They were not crafted as puzzles for 21st century viewers with search engines and disaster documentaries. They belonged to local histories, dynastic claims, ritual contexts, political landscapes, and religious ideas that we are still working to understand. When we force them to answer our questions directly, we risk misunderstanding the questions they were originally meant to answer. A date carved into stone might have celebrated a ruler's legitimacy. It might have positioned a local event within cosmic time. It might have marked a ritual obligation. It might have invoked gods, ancestors, or the renewal of order. It might have done several of these things at once. Maya writing could be dense, layered, and formal. It did not exist to give outsiders a simple prophecy. Yet the mystery grew precisely because the evidence was not simple. A complete, clear inscription saying, "The world will end on this date," would have been dramatic, but it would also have been easier to test, challenge, and reject. The actual situation was murkier. A damaged monument, a major cycle ending, a divine reference, scholarly disagreement over details, enough authenticity to feel serious, enough uncertainty to be reshaped. That is a perfect environment for myth. The deeper issue is selective interpretation. People rarely approached the evidence neutrally. They arrived already carrying the apocalypse story, then searched the stones for confirmation. A phrase became a warning. A missing section became a secret. A calendrical ending became a cosmic sentence. This does not mean the ancient evidence should be dismissed. It means it should be respected enough not to be overused. Respecting evidence includes admitting when it cannot support the claims placed upon it. The inscriptions associated with 2012 tell us that the 13th baktun was not a modern invention. It was part of a real Maya calendrical framework. They suggest that this distant period ending could be imagined and recorded. They may connect the event to divine or ritual language, but they do not give us a clear ancient doctrine of apocalypse. The stones do not say what the legend needed them to say, and perhaps that is why the legend had to speak so loudly. The less certainty there was in the source material, the more certainty appeared in popular retellings. The careful phrases of scholarship became blunt claims. May refer to became predicts. Period ending became end of the world. Damaged text became lost prophecy. The story grew stronger each time a nuance was removed. There is a kind of violence in that, though it is not the violence of conquest or burning books. It is the quieter violence of making another culture's surviving words serve our own drama. The Maya carved dates into stone to hold memory against decay. Later readers turned some of those dates into a countdown to terror. And between those two acts lies one of the central lessons of the 2012 myth. Fragments are powerful, but they are also vulnerable. They can illuminate the past, or they can be made to perform in a theater they never belonged to. So the mystery of the 13th baktun is not hidden in a single carved warning. It is hidden in the distance between evidence and interpretation. A broken monument can tell us many things, but it cannot carry the end of the world alone. When modern people imagined the Maya apocalypse, they often imagined a prediction without a world behind it, a date, a warning, a sudden end. But ancient Maya thought did not separate time from gods, kings, sacrifice, ancestry, and cosmic order. A calendar date was not an isolated number. It belonged to a crowded universe, one filled with divine beings, layered realms, dangerous transitions, and obligations that humans could not simply ignore. This is where the 2012 myth becomes especially misleading. It borrowed the atmosphere of Maya religion, but rarely took the religion seriously. The gods of the Maya were not simple characters with one job each, like figures in a neat modern chart. They could be complex, shifting, overlapping, and difficult to reduce. A deity might be linked to rain, lightning, fertility, kingship, maize, death, war, or creation, depending on the context and period. Divine forces were not always gentle, but they were not merely monsters waiting at the edge of the calendar either. They were part of a system in which existence had to be maintained. That idea matters. In many Maya traditions, the cosmos was not a stable machine that ran by itself forever. Order had been established through sacred acts, and that order required renewal. Human beings lived in relation to powers that could nourish, punish, transform, or withdraw. The world was not doomed in a simple linear sense, but it was fragile. Balance could be disturbed. Cycles could become dangerous. Ritual action helped hold the pattern together. This is very different from the modern disaster version of 2012. The popular story imagined the ancient Maya as passive observers, looking forward through time and seeing catastrophe. But Maya kings and ritual specialists were not passive observers. They acted. They performed ceremonies. They dedicated monuments. They made offerings. They timed events according to sacred cycles. They sought to communicate with gods and ancestors, not because the future was fixed and unreachable, but because the relationship between human society and cosmic order demanded attention. The divine world was not only above them, it pressed into politics. A ruler's power depended partly on his ability to present himself as more than an administrator of land and tribute. He had to stand at the meeting point between people and sacred forces. His rituals could show that he understood the calendar, that he could honor period endings, that he could sustain the connection between the city and the unseen order around it. In that sense, the gods were also political, not because they were invented for politics, but because political authority was inseparable from sacred responsibility. A king who failed ritually did not merely look incompetent. He risked appearing cosmically dangerous. If drought came, if war went badly, if crops failed, if rivals triumphed, people could read those events through a world in which divine favor, calendrical order, and royal legitimacy were deeply entangled. The gods at the edge of time were therefore not necessarily heralds of doom. They were witnesses to order being renewed, or failing to be renewed. This distinction is easy to miss, because destruction does appear in Maya mythic thought. Creation and destruction are not strangers there. Worlds can be made, unmade, attempted, corrected. Divine beings can defeat, sacrifice, deceive, transform, and restore. But destruction is not always the final word. Often it is part of a wider movement toward recreation. That movement is one reason outsiders have so often misunderstood Maya religion. When a tradition speaks of previous worlds, dangerous gods, sacrifice, and cosmic cycles, a modern listener trained on apocalyptic storytelling may hear only one thing: the end is coming. But in a cyclical, sacred worldview, destruction may be one phase in a larger drama of renewal. The question is not simply whether something ends. The question is what the ending does, and what humans must do when it arrives. Sacrifice in this context has to be handled carefully. It is one of the most sensationalized aspects of Mesoamerican religion, and it has often been used to make ancient peoples seem exotic, cruel, or alien. The reality is more complicated and more uncomfortable. Bloodletting, offering, and forms of sacrifice were tied to communication with gods and ancestors, to rulership, fertility, debt, and renewal. These practices could be violent, but they were not random. They belonged to a moral and cosmic logic in which life force, obligation, and sacred exchange mattered intensely. To modern eyes, this may feel severe. It was severe. But reducing it to horror misses its function inside the worldview. The Maya were not simply trying to appease angry gods in a crude sense. Ritual action helped bind society to the cosmic order. It made invisible relationships visible. It turned kingship into performance and pain into proof. There is a reason rulers are often shown in ritual scenes that emphasize blood, vision, and divine encounter. These images are not casual decoration. They declare access. They say, the ruler can open the path. The ruler can speak across boundaries. The ruler knows when and how to act. This matters for the idea of prophecy. In modern culture, prophecy often means a statement about what will happen later, a prediction, a message from the future. But in the Maya world, the authority surrounding time was often less about announcing a single unavoidable event and more about managing relationships across cycles. The calendar gave structure to meaning. It allowed the present to be linked with mythic events, ancestral precedents, and future obligations. A period ending was a stage on which this authority could be displayed. So when later readers imagined a god returning at the completion of the 13th baktun, they often treated that return like the entrance of a destroyer in a disaster film. But divine return, in a Maya context, need not mean planetary annihilation. It could mean recurrence, ritual presence, commemoration, or the reactivation of mythic order. The language of gods and time is powerful, but powerful does not automatically mean apocalyptic. The evidence becomes thinner when people try to turn these ideas into a precise 2012 scenario. Ancient Maya mythology gives us worlds of creation, destruction, and renewal. It gives us gods tied to sacrifice, maize, rain, death, and kingship. It gives us a cosmos alive with cycle and obligation. But it does not give us a clear, unified doctrine saying that the 13th baktun would end human existence. That absence matters. It does not make the Maya less mysterious. It makes them more human. Their myths were not written as a secret forecast for strangers thousands of years later. They helped explain why the world exists, why rulers matter, why rituals must be performed, why death and life are connected, and why time cannot be treated as empty. Modern apocalypse theories took that sacred complexity and narrowed it into one blunt image: ancient gods coming back to punish the world. But the gods of Maya thought were never that simple. They were bound to rain falling on fields, to maize rising from the earth, to kings drawing blood, to ancestors appearing in vision, to the sun moving through peril and return, to the repeated labor of keeping the universe in balance. If there was a warning in this worldview, it was not necessarily that time would one day stop. It was that order is never effortless. Cycles turn, but they do not absolve human beings from responsibility. Renewal requires attention. Power requires legitimacy. Life depends on forces that can be honored, neglected, misunderstood, or abused. This may be less dramatic than a planet cracking in half, but it is far closer to the atmosphere of Maya sacred thought. The modern world wanted a prophecy because prophecy feels clean. Someone knows. Something will happen. The date is fixed. The fear has a shape. Maya religion offers something more demanding. A universe where meaning is woven through repetition, where gods do not simply announce endings, but participate in the maintenance of worlds, and where human beings are not spectators at the edge of time, but participants in its fragile balance. That is why the gods who return at the edge of time should not be imagined as messengers of a single final catastrophe. They are reminders that for the Maya, time was never empty. It was inhabited. To understand why the 2012 myth found such fertile ground, we have to enter a story where the world is not created once and left alone. It is tried. It fails. It is remade. One of the most important doorways into Maya creation thought is the Popol Vuh, a sacred narrative preserved in the Quiche Maya tradition after the Spanish conquest. The version known today passed through a colonial-era history of copying, translation, and survival, so it must be approached carefully. It is not a simple transcript from the classic Maya world, and it cannot be used as though every ancient Maya city believed every line in exactly the same way. But it preserves powerful themes that help us understand a broader Mesoamerican imagination. Creation as a process, humanity as fragile, and the world as something shaped through cycles of failure, correction, and renewal. The Popol Vuh does not open with a tidy universe. It begins in a state before human noise, before roads, before fields, before the familiar weight of daily life. There is sky, there is sea, there is stillness. Divine beings deliberate. Creation is spoken, formed, tested. The world does not simply appear like a finished monument. It emerges through intention, experiment, and dissatisfaction. That detail is crucial. In many modern tellings, creation is imagined as an event at the beginning of time. A divine act happens, the world exists, and history begins moving forward. But in the Popol Vuh, creation is more like a difficult search for the right kind of being, a creature capable of recognition, speech, memory, gratitude, and ritual. The gods are not merely making bodies. They are trying to make beings who can remember them. The first attempts fail. There are animals, but they cannot properly speak the names of their makers. Their sounds are not the speech the creators seek. Then come figures made of mud, but they are weak, unstable, unable to endure. They soften and collapse. Later, beings of wood are made. They can move. They can multiply. They resemble people in some outward sense, but they lack heart, memory, and reverence. They do not remember their creators, and so they are destroyed. This is one of the places where later readers, especially those already searching for apocalypse, can feel a thrill of recognition. Previous worlds, failed humans, destruction, a new humanity rising afterward. It sounds from a distance like an ancient doctrine of recurring catastrophe, but the meaning is more precise than that. The Popol Vuh is not simply saying worlds are destroyed. It is asking what humanity is for. What makes a human being human? Is it movement, speech, shape, survival, or is it memory, obligation, relationship, the ability to honor the powers that made life possible? The wooden people fail not because they lack technology or strength, but because they lack sacred awareness. They inhabit the world without gratitude. Even their household objects turn against them in some retellings of the episode, as if the neglected world itself has begun to testify. The grinding stones, cooking tools, and animals become witnesses against a humanity that used everything and remembered nothing. That image is more unsettling than a meteor. It suggests that destruction is not random. It follows a rupture in relationship. A world can fail because its inhabitants do not understand the debt built into existence. The successful humans in the Popol Vuh are made from maize. That is not a minor poetic touch. Maize was not merely a crop. It was food, body, ancestry, economy, ritual, and identity. To say humans are made from maize is to bind human life to the earth, the seasons, agricultural labor, divine provision, and community survival. The human body itself becomes a reminder that life is borrowed from the world that feeds it. This is where the creation story becomes deeply different from the modern 2012 panic. The modern apocalypse story was obsessed with what might happen to us from outside. A planet, a solar flare, a hidden force, a cosmic mechanism. The Popol Vuh points inward as much as outward. It asks whether human beings are living in right relationship with the forces that sustain them. It is less a disaster forecast than a moral and sacred diagnosis. Of course, we have to be cautious. The Popol Vuh is not a direct explanation of December 21st, 2012. It does not say that the 13th baktun would bring the destruction of the current world. Using it that way would repeat the same mistake we are trying to unravel, taking a complex tradition and forcing it to answer a modern rumor. But the Popol Vuh does help explain why outsiders could so easily attach end times expectations to Maya culture. The ingredients were there for misunderstanding. Multiple creations, failed beings, divine judgment, cycles of making and unmaking, a universe in which humans have obligations to sacred powers. Remove those ideas from their narrative and ritual context, and they begin to look like a prediction machine. Within context, they are richer. The earlier worlds are not merely a countdown toward doom. They are a meditation on the difficulty of creation. They show a cosmos in which humanity is not guaranteed by default. To be human is to occupy a role that can be fulfilled badly. Memory matters, speech matters, ritual matters, food matters. The relationship between gods, earth, and people must be sustained. This may be one reason the Popol Vuh has such force even now. It does not flatter humanity. It does not assume that intelligence alone makes us worthy. The wooden people can function, but they are spiritually empty. They resemble humans, but they do not understand what human life is meant to remember. There is a quiet warning there, though not the one sold in 2012. A society can continue moving while forgetting why it exists. It can build, multiply, consume, and speak, while losing its relationship to what sustains it. The danger is not always sudden destruction. Sometimes the danger is becoming hollow before the end arrives. That thought gives Maya creation stories their depth. They do not need an apocalyptic date to feel urgent. They already understand that worlds are fragile. But fragility, again, is not the same as fatalism. The Popol Vuh is not only a story of failed creations, it is also a story of persistence. Divine beings try again. The world is remade. Humanity is formed from maize. The present world carries the memory of earlier failures, but it is not meaningless because of them. If anything, those failures make the present more precious. This is the heart of cyclical sacred time. The past does not disappear behind us. It returns as pattern, instruction, and warning. Earlier worlds explain the responsibilities of this one. Destruction is remembered not as spectacle, but as a lesson about balance. And that is exactly what the 2012 myth stripped away. It took the idea of previous worlds and turned it into a suspense device. It took renewal and emphasized ruin. It took a tradition concerned with relationship and made it sound like a cosmic execution date. The result was exciting, marketable, and almost completely inverted. The Popol Vuh asks a slower question. Not when will the world end, but what kind of beings are worthy of the world continuing? That question does not expire when a date passes. It does not need a countdown clock. It lingers because it is not really about the calendar at all. It is about memory, obligation, and the strange burden of being made from something living. In the end, the worlds before this one did not teach that every cycle must close in terror. They taught that creation itself is a responsibility. And for the Maya, that responsibility was not abstract. It was performed in fields, in temples, in blood, in offerings, in royal ceremonies, and in the careful timing of acts meant to keep the cosmic order alive. A Maya king did not rule only by sitting on a throne. He ruled by standing inside time. That may sound strange at first, because modern politics often tries to present power as practical. Laws, armies, wealth, borders, administration. Ancient Maya power certainly had practical sides. Rulers commanded labor, organized building projects, formed alliances, fought wars, arranged marriages, claimed tribute, and competed fiercely with rival cities. But their authority also depended on something less visible and more difficult to translate. A ruler had to show that he knew how the universe worked. He had to know the days. He had to honor the cycles. He had to connect his city to ancestors and gods. He had to turn political power into cosmic performance. This is where the modern idea of prophecy begins to blur. When we hear that an ancient ruler recorded a future date or tied his reign to a sacred cycle, We may imagine prediction in the modern sense, as though he were making a forecast. But in the Maya world, dates could do something more complex. They could authorize. They could legitimize. They could make an event feel inevitable, ancient, sacred, and larger than the ambitions of one man. A carved monument might show a ruler in ceremonial dress, surrounded by glyphs and dates, presenting himself not as a temporary politician, but as the living hinge between earthly society and cosmic order. The inscription could place his birth, accession, victories, rituals, and period-ending ceremonies within a timeline reaching backward into myth and forward beyond his death. In that setting, time became a political instrument, not because the calendar was fake, because it was powerful. The Maya did not need to separate astronomy, religion, and kingship into modern categories. A celestial cycle could be scientifically observed, ritually meaningful, and politically useful at the same time. Venus could be a real object in the sky and also a sign folded into warfare, timing, and divine association. A period ending could be a mathematical event and also a ceremonial opportunity. A ruler could use sacred knowledge sincerely and strategically, because in his world, those motives did not always cancel each other out. This is one of the hardest things to recover from the ruins. Not what the Maya knew, but how their knowledge functioned. A calendar is never just a calendar when power depends on timing. Whoever controls the timing of rituals controls the rhythm of public life. Whoever understands the rare dates can present himself as the one who hears the deeper order. Whoever connects his dynasty to distant cycles can make a local throne feel woven into the structure of the cosmos. For ordinary people living under such a system, time would not have been an abstract, scholarly achievement. It would have appeared in festivals, labor obligations, ceremonies, royal appearances, offerings, processions, and public monuments. The sacred calendar entered the body of society. It told people when to gather, when to fear, when to celebrate, when to remember, and when to witness the ruler doing what only the ruler was supposed to do. That is why period endings mattered so much. A ruler who presided over the completion of a cycle was not merely attending a date on the calendar. He was demonstrating competence before visible and invisible audiences. The city watched, rivals watched, ancestors were invoked, gods were honored. The carved record remained after the crowd dispersed, telling future generations that the ruler had stood at the appointed moment and helped maintain order. This does not mean every ceremony was cynical theater. It means theater itself was sacred. The public act carried meaning. Costume, gesture, blood, incense, music, procession, speech, and inscription all work together to make authority visible. Bloodletting, especially among elites, belong to this world of visible sacrifice and divine contact. It is easy for modern audiences to recoil from it, and that reaction is understandable. But recoil alone does not explain anything. In Maya royal ritual, blood could act as an offering, a sign of devotion, a medium of communication with gods and ancestors, and a proof of the ruler's willingness to endure pain on behalf of cosmic order. The ruler's body became part of the machinery. That phrase may sound cold, but the idea is intimate. The body of the king was not merely personal. It was political, sacred, and symbolic. When royal blood was offered, the act said that the ruler's own life force belonged to something larger than private comfort. It dramatized a debt between humans and divine powers. It showed that order required cost. Here again, we see how misleading the 2012 myth became. Modern doomsday theories imagined ancient Maya knowledge as a hidden announcement about the future. But much of Maya prophetic authority worked through action, not prediction. The important question was not simply, what will happen? It was, what must be done at the proper time? That difference changes the entire story. In a world of sacred cycles, knowing the future did not necessarily mean escaping it or warning strangers centuries later. It meant preparing rituals, aligning political acts with powerful dates, and proving that the ruler could keep his city synchronized with the cosmos. The calendar gave kings a language of destiny, but destiny was performed, not merely awaited. This is why Maya inscriptions often feel both historical and ceremonial. They record events, but they also elevate them. A battle may be dated, a captive may be displayed, a building may be dedicated, a king may take power. Yet the date does more than place the event in sequence. It gives the event weight. It says, this happened when time itself carried a particular charge. Modern politics still does something similar, though usually in a less cosmic form. Leaders choose anniversaries for speeches. Nations inaugurate monuments on symbolic dates. Military actions, treaties, commemorations, and public ceremonies are often timed to create historical resonance. We pretend to be very rational about time, but power still loves a meaningful calendar. The Maya simply made that relationship explicit, and they did so with a grandeur that could stretch far beyond one human life. A ruler might connect himself to ancestors who had ruled before him, to mythic episodes from deep time, and to future period endings that would outlast him. This was not just vanity, it was a strategy of continuity. In a competitive landscape of city-states, where dynasties rose, fractured, and fought, cosmic time offered a way to make fragile human power appear anchored in something enduring. But that very strategy also reveals anxiety. If royal inscriptions insist so strongly on order, legitimacy, and cosmic connection, it may be because those things were never guaranteed. Cities competed, dynasties failed, droughts came, alliances broke, captives were taken. Monuments could proclaim stability, while the political world beneath them trembled. The machinery of the cosmos was not a comforting machine. It required maintenance because disorder was always possible. That is the darker intelligence of Maya rulership. It understood that power must be renewed, not once, but repeatedly. A king could not simply inherit the universe. He had to perform his relationship with it again and again. This gives us a better way to understand the later obsession with 2012. The modern world saw a great cycle ending and asked, what did the Maya predict would happen to us? But an ancient Maya ruler might have asked a different question. What must be done when the cycle turns? That is not a small difference. It is the difference between spectatorship and responsibility. The 2012 panic made humanity into an audience waiting for a cosmic event. Maya ritual time made human beings participants in a fragile order. The calendar was not there simply to reveal fate. It was there to organize action. And in the hands of kings, it became one of the most powerful instruments ever carved into stone. A way to make politics sacred, to make memory durable, and to make a ruler's blood seem necessary to the turning of the world. Ruins can be deceptive. A city swallowed by forest invites a simple story. Greatness, collapse, disappearance. The mind wants a clean arc. First there is splendor, then there is disaster, then there is silence. It is a satisfying shape, which is exactly why it should make us suspicious. The ancient Maya world did experience profound disruption, especially during the decline of many classic period cities in the southern lowlands. Temples were no longer raised with the same intensity. Long count inscriptions became less frequent in some regions. Royal courts fractured. Political centers that had once projected power across landscapes were abandoned, transformed, or absorbed into different patterns of life. Something major happened. But the Maya vanished is one of the most stubbornly false sentences in popular history. Cities declined, dynasties failed, populations moved, political systems changed. But Maya people did not disappear. Their descendants continued to live, speak, farm, trade, worship, adapt, resist, and remember. The collapse of certain royal courts was not the extinction of a civilization. It was the end of a particular order. That distinction matters because the 2012 myth depended heavily on the atmosphere of disappearance. The Maya were often presented as a vanished people who had left behind a final cryptic message, like a civilization exiting history after carving one last warning into stone. The romance of the abandoned city made the prophecy feel more powerful. Dead civilizations in modern imagination are easier to turn into oracles. They cannot object. But the classic Maya decline was not a single event, and it was not the same everywhere. It unfolded unevenly across regions and generations. Some cities suffered earlier, others later. Some areas were hit hard, while others continued in new forms. The causes were also multiple, overlapping, and still debated in detail. Environmental stress likely played a role, especially in regions where dense populations depended on difficult water management and fragile agricultural systems. Periods of drought may have intensified pressure on food supplies, political legitimacy, and social stability. Warfare also mattered. Rival kingdoms fought, captured elites, disrupted trade, and weakened the networks that allowed royal courts to function. Political fragmentation could turn stress into crisis, as rulers competed for authority in a landscape where legitimacy had to be constantly performed. And then there is the problem of expectations. A Maya king had to do more than govern. He had to maintain order in a sacred sense. He had to appear capable of mediating between the human and divine worlds. But what happens when the rain does not come? What happens when rivals win? What happens when monuments promise cosmic order, while ordinary people see hunger, conflict, and uncertainty? A drought is never only a drought when kings claim cosmic responsibility. This does not mean people simply blamed rulers for every environmental disaster. Human societies are more complex than that. But in a world where rulership was tied to sacred performance, repeated failure could weaken the entire symbolic structure of power. The calendar could mark ceremonies, blood could be offered, monuments could be carved. Yet if the lived reality kept worsening, the machinery of legitimacy may have begun to grind. The decline of classic Maya cities should not be imagined as one dramatic night of destruction. It was more likely a long unraveling in many places. Strained resources, elite competition, shifting alliances, migration, warfare, changing trade routes, and perhaps deep disillusionment with royal institutions that could no longer deliver what they claimed to uphold. That kind of collapse is harder to film, but more historically honest. It is also more unsettling. A sudden apocalypse lets us imagine history as something that happens from outside. A comet, a curse, an invasion, a divine sentence. A slow unraveling is less theatrical, but it feels closer to the way real societies break. Systems fail unevenly, leaders improvise, people leave before the official ending. Monuments remain standing long after belief in them has weakened. A city can be physically present and politically dead. Another can lose its court, but not its people. This is why the empty stone plazas of the Maya world should not be read as evidence of a vanished race. They are evidence of transformation. Some communities moved toward more sustainable locations. Others reorganized around different centers. In the northern lowlands, major cities continued to flourish after many southern centers had declined. Later, Maya polities remained powerful enough to confront, resist, negotiate with, and outlast waves of foreign intrusion. The myth of disappearance hides all of that. It turns living history into scenery. And once a people are turned into scenery, their calendars become easier to misuse. Their gods become symbols. Their writings become puzzles. Their descendants become almost invisible beside the ruined temples marketed as mysterious relics. This is one of the quiet injuries caused by popular fascination with lost civilizations. It often prefers the dead version of a culture to the living one. The Maya past is full of mystery, but not because the people vanished into thin air. The mystery lies in complexity. How did individual cities respond differently to stress? Why did some royal courts fail while others adapted? How did ordinary families experience the decline of systems built around kings, monuments, and sacred calendars? What memories survived when political capitals were abandoned? Which rituals continued outside elite inscriptions? Which stories changed because they had to? The evidence gives us pieces, not a single clean answer. Archaeology can trace settlement changes, construction patterns, water systems, warfare, trade goods, burials, burned structures, and abandoned spaces. Inscriptions can reveal dynastic conflict and political ambition. Environmental studies can suggest drought and landscape pressure. But none of these alone explains everything. The decline of the classic Maya world was not a riddle with one key. It was a convergence. And convergence is often where myth begins. When later generations looked at the ruins, they did not always see a complicated web of environmental, political, and social causes. They saw silence. They saw temples without kings. They saw carved dates without voices to explain them fully. Into that silence, stories entered. Some were scholarly and cautious. Others were romantic. Others were openly fantastical. The less people understood the living continuity of Maya communities, the easier it became to imagine the ancient Maya as a vanished prophetic race. But myths survive for reasons. The fall of empires, kingdoms, and city-states creates emotional residue. People want to know why greatness fails. They look at monumental architecture and ask how anything so ambitious could be abandoned. They wonder whether the builders knew it was coming. They search for warnings in the ruins because warnings make disaster feel intelligible. This is where the 2012 story drew some of its emotional power. If the Maya had watched their own cities decline, perhaps, the modern imagination suggested, they had seen something larger too. Maybe they had understood the rhythm of catastrophe. Maybe their calendar contained not only sacred cycles, but a memory of collapse projected into the future. It is an alluring thought, but it mistakes historical trauma for supernatural foresight. The Maya did know that worlds could change. They saw dynasties rise and fall. They recorded defeat and renewal. They lived with drought, war, political fragility, and the constant need to maintain balance. Their histories did not need an invented apocalypse to be profound. They already contained the knowledge that order is temporary unless sustained. When empires fall, myths survive because ruins ask questions the living cannot always answer neatly. But the survival of myth should not be confused with proof of prophecy. The classic Maya collapse was not the end of the Maya. It was a reminder that even the most elaborate systems of power, ritual, and cosmic meaning are still built by human beings under pressure from land, weather, ambition, violence, and time. And when those systems break, the stones may remain. But the story does not stop there. The most devastating silence in Maya history was not created by abandoned cities. It was created by fire. When the Spanish entered Maya lands in the 16th century, they did not arrive in an empty world of ruins and vanished prophets. They entered a living world of towns, rulers, languages, rituals, books, trade, memory, and resistance. The Maya were not waiting in the shadows of their ancestors. They were still there, still adapting, still carrying histories that had survived the decline of earlier kingdoms. This is important because conquest often rewrites the stage before it begins the play. It likes to imagine the land as waiting, weakened, fragmented, almost destined to be taken. But the Spanish arrival was not the discovery of a dead civilization. It was an invasion into a living one. And among the many wounds of colonization, one of the deepest was an assault on memory itself. The Spanish conquest of Maya regions was not a single swift event. It unfolded unevenly, violently, and over a long period. Different Maya communities responded in different ways. Some fought, some negotiated, some retreated, some made temporary alliances, some survived by adapting outwardly while preserving what they could beneath the surface of colonial rule. There was no single Maya response because there was no single Maya political body. The landscape was diverse, and that diversity shaped both resistance and survival. But missionaries and colonial authorities shared a powerful goal: conversion. To convert a people, it is not enough to change what they say in public. You must change what they remember, what they fear, what they honor, what they teach their children, what they count as sacred. The old gods must be demoted into demons. The old rituals must be treated as crimes. The old books must become threats. This is where the war on memory became literal. Maya manuscripts, painted and folded in screenfold form, once preserved astronomical tables, ritual knowledge, divination, calendrical cycles, and histories that we can now only partly imagine. We do not know exactly how many existed. That uncertainty itself is painful. Enough survived for Spanish missionaries to recognize them as dangerous. Enough were destroyed that the loss still shapes everything scholars can and cannot say. The most infamous episode is associated with Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar in Yucatan, who in 1562 ordered the destruction of Maya sacred objects and books at Mani. From his perspective, these materials were instruments of idolatry. From the perspective of history, it was an intellectual catastrophe. One does not have to romanticize every manuscript as a lost masterpiece to understand the scale of the damage. Imagine if most written records of an entire civilization's astronomy, ritual practice, mythology, dynastic memory, and interpretation of time were deliberately burned. And then centuries later, people demanded a simple answer about what that civilization really believed. The problem is not merely that the answer is difficult. The problem is that part of the archive was murdered. That is a harsh word. It is also hard to avoid. Because books are not only objects, they are systems of memory. They hold arguments, corrections, names, variations, contradictions, technical procedures, and ordinary details that stone monuments often do not preserve. Stone favors kings. Books can preserve the rhythm of specialists, scribes, ritual calendars, and living practice. When the books were destroyed, the loss was not just quantity, it was texture. And texture matters when we are trying to understand something as complex as Maya time. Later generations inherited gaps. Scholars worked with inscriptions, archaeology, colonial documents, surviving codices, oral traditions, and comparative evidence. They accomplished extraordinary things. But even the best scholarship must sometimes speak through absence. We know enough to reject the simplistic 2012 apocalypse story, yet we also know that the surviving record is incomplete. That incompleteness helped create the space where speculation could grow. The irony is bitter. First, colonial destruction erased enormous portions of Maya written knowledge. Then, much later, modern outsiders looked at the fragments that remained and treated the gaps as mystery, as if the past itself had chosen to hide. But many of those gaps were not natural. They were produced by conquest, fear, religious violence, and the confidence of men who believed they were saving souls by destroying memory. This does not mean everything was lost. Maya peoples continued to carry knowledge through language, ritual, community practice, oral tradition, adaptation, and resistance. Some knowledge moved underground, some changed form, some blended with Catholic imagery while preserving older patterns beneath new names. Colonial suppression was powerful, but it was never total. That survival is one of the most important parts of the story. The colonizers tried to make Maya sacred history illegible. They failed to erase it completely. Still, the damage remains. When people today ask whether the Maya predicted the end of the world, the honest answer must include the fact that our sources are uneven. We have stone inscriptions, but many are political and elite. We have a few surviving books, but only a few. We have colonial-era accounts, but they often passed through the hands of missionaries who misunderstood, condemned, or reshaped what they recorded. We have living traditions, but they cannot simply be flattened into ancient classic Maya belief without care. Every source speaks. Every source also has limits. That is why certainty can be dangerous. The 2012 myth thrived on certainty. It spoke loudly where the evidence was quiet. It claimed to know exactly what ancient Maya time meant, exactly what a cycle ending implied, exactly what the date would bring. But anyone who has stood honestly before the shattered archive should be more humble. The past does not owe us a clean prophecy. It asks us to listen to what survived while remembering what was taken. There is also a moral dimension here that cannot be ignored. When modern media used Maya imagery to sell apocalypse, it often treated Maya culture as a mysterious aesthetic rather than a history marked by real violence. Temples, glyphs, masks, calendars, and gods became mood pieces for entertainment. Rarely did the same stories pause to explain why so many Maya books no longer exist, or how colonial power shaped the very mystery being marketed. The missing books were not just atmospheric emptiness. They were evidence of a war against old ceremonies, a war against writing, a war against the right of a people to preserve their own relationship with time. And yet, memory survived in stubborn ways. It survived in speech, in ritual calendars, in local histories, in woven patterns of identity, in communities that endured forced conversion, disease, tribute, labor demands, land loss, and political domination. It survived not as a frozen museum piece, but as something living, altered, wounded, resilient. The Spanish arrival did not create the Maya mystery. It fractured the record through which later people would try to understand it. That fracture is central to everything that followed. Because when only pieces remain, the temptation is always to make the pieces say more than they can. One burned library can produce centuries of speculation. One missing context can turn a date into a rumor. One damaged archive can become the birthplace of a modern myth. So before we look at the few Maya books that escaped destruction, we have to understand what their survival means. They are not merely rare artifacts. They are survivors of an attempted forgetting. A surviving book is never just a book when so many others were burned. It becomes a witness. The Maya codices that remain today are among the most precious windows into the old systems of time, ritual, astronomy, and divination. They are not easy windows. They do not open onto a complete room. They are fragmentary, specialized, and difficult, full of signs, tables, gods, numbers, and cycles that require careful interpretation. But they prove something essential. Maya knowledge was not only carved into stone for kings, it was also written, calculated, painted, consulted, and carried in a form that could be held in human hands. That may seem obvious, but it changes the atmosphere of the story. Stone monuments feel public and permanent. They stand in plazas. They announce power. They are meant to be seen. A codex is different. It suggests use. It suggests specialists bending over pages, reading patterns, calculating intervals, turning knowledge into practice. It belongs to a quieter intellectual world. Not less sacred, not less powerful, but more intimate. The surviving codices reveal a civilization deeply concerned with cycles, lunar tables, Venus tables, ritual almanacs, divinatory sequences, gods appearing in patterned arrangements of days. These books show time not as a blank measurement, but as something to be interpreted. A day could be favorable or dangerous. A celestial event could be watched, calculated, and placed inside a ritual frame. The sky was not merely admired, it was read. And yet, the codices also remind us of how little survives. Only a handful of pre-Columbian Maya books are known today, compared with what must once have been a far larger written tradition. The imbalance is staggering. We are not dealing with a library that has lost a few volumes. We are dealing with a civilization whose written memory was reduced to scattered survivors, while later generations tried to reconstruct whole systems from the remains. That loss should make us careful. It should also make us angry, quietly, if not loudly. Because the surviving books are often asked to do too much, people look at them and hope for final answers. Did the Maya predict the future? What did they believe about the end of time? What did the 13th baktun mean? What exactly was supposed to happen when cycles turned? These are reasonable questions, but the remaining books cannot answer all of them. They were not designed as a complete encyclopedia of Maya thought, and they certainly were not written to settle modern arguments about 2012. What they can show is more subtle. They show that Maya intellectual life was disciplined, mathematical, ritualized, and deeply attentive to recurrence. The movements of Venus, for example, were not random lights in the sky. They were tracked through repeated intervals, tied to divinatory meaning and ritual timing. The moon, too, mattered within cycles that helped structure ceremonies and interpretation. The codices preserved the sense of a world where celestial regularity and sacred danger could coexist. That combination is important. Modern people sometimes divide knowledge into two boxes: science on one side, religion on the other. The Maya codices do not fit comfortably into that division. Their astronomical calculations could be precise and observational, while also embedded in a religious system of signs, gods, and ritual obligation. To call them only scientific would flatten them. To call them only mystical would also flatten them. They are evidence of a mind that did not need to choose between measuring the heavens and finding meaning there. This is one reason the 2012 myth was so crude by comparison. It took a vast tradition of observing cycles and reduced it to one dramatic claim: the calendar ends, so the world ends. But the codices show a culture far more interested in repetition, timing, interpretation, and renewal than in a single terminal event. Their world is rhythmic, not simply catastrophic. Dangerous, yes. Sacred, yes. Charged with forces that required knowledge and care, but not a cheap countdown clock. There is also something humbling about the physical survival of the codices. These books endured not because history was gentle with them, but because a few escaped the many forms of destruction that consumed the rest. Their pages passed through time almost impossibly. They survived humidity, insects, neglect, conquest, religious violence, collecting, travel, and the fragility of their own materials. To look at them is to feel both gratitude and incompleteness. Gratitude because something survived. Incompleteness because we know survival was the exception. That incompleteness has shaped everything. It has made scholars cautious, and it has made sensationalists bold. A careful interpreter sees the gaps and says, "We must not overclaim." A sensational interpreter sees the same gaps and says, "Anything could be hidden there." The difference between those two responses is the difference between respecting the past and exploiting its wounds. The lost books created a silence, but silence is not permission. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere in the destroyed manuscripts there was a clear answer to the 2012 question. Perhaps a page explaining the 13th baktun. Perhaps a ritual sequence for the cycle ending. perhaps a myth now lost. That is possible in the broadest sense, because lost texts may have contained many things we cannot recover. But possibility is not evidence. We cannot use burned books to prove the story we wish existed. What we can say is that the surviving codices support a picture of Maya time as layered, sacred, and technically sophisticated. They show divination, astronomy, ritual cycles, and a deep commitment to pattern. They do not support the modern claim that the Maya left behind a clear global doomsday prophecy for December 21st, 2012. That is the honest boundary, and boundaries matter when history has already been damaged. If we cross them too casually, we commit a second kind of destruction, not by fire, but by distortion. We take the few remaining voices from a wounded archive and force them to speak lines they never wrote. The codices deserve better than that. They deserve to be read as evidence of an intellectual world in which time was not passive, the heavens were not mute, and ritual knowledge was a form of power. They deserve to be understood as remnants of a broader tradition, not magical props in an apocalypse story. The few books that remain do not solve every mystery. They deepen it responsibly. They tell us that the Maya were watching the sky with patience. They were counting days with care. They were linking gods, numbers, offerings, and celestial motion into systems that modern readers are still working to understand. They remind us that what was lost was immense, and that what survived must be handled with restraint. In the end, the codices do not shout about the end of the world. They do something quieter. They show us a civilization listening to time. And perhaps that is why the surviving pages feel so powerful. They are not the voice of a vanished people speaking doom across the centuries. They are fragments of a living intelligence, preserved against destruction, asking us to read more carefully than those who came before us burned. The path from ancient calendar to global panic did not begin with a lie. That is what makes the story more interesting. It began with real scholarship, real decipherment, real archaeological work, and real fascination with the brilliance of Maya timekeeping. Researchers spent generations studying inscriptions, monuments, codices, architecture, colonial sources, and living traditions. They learned how dates worked. They reconstructed dynastic histories. They began to hear in the glyphs voices that had once seemed locked away. This was patient work, slow work. The kind of work that does not look dramatic on camera unless you understand what is at stake. A sign identified, a date correlated, a ruler's name recovered, a pattern recognized across sites. Piece by piece, the Maya past became less silent. But knowledge does not remain inside the academy. It travels. And as Maya calendrical knowledge moved outward into popular culture, it changed shape. Some of that change was harmless. People became fascinated by ancient astronomy, sacred time, temples aligned with celestial cycles, and the intellectual power of a civilization too often underestimated. Curiosity can be a good doorway. Many people who first encountered the Maya through mystery later discovered the real history was far richer than the myth. But curiosity can also become a market. By the late 20th century, the idea of 2012 had begun drifting through New Age circles, alternative spirituality, speculative books, lectures, and eventually the internet. The 13th baktun was reimagined not merely as a calendar period ending, but as a threshold for planetary transformation. For some writers, it meant a shift in consciousness. For others, a spiritual awakening. For others still, the collapse of existing systems before a new age could begin. Then the darker versions attached themselves. Disaster theories multiplied because they were easier to visualize. A hidden planet, a solar catastrophe, a reversal of the poles, a cosmic alignment, a secret known by the ancients and ignored by the arrogant modern world. Some claims borrowed the language of science without the discipline of science. Others borrowed Maya imagery without the burden of Maya context. The result was not one single 2012 theory. It was a marketplace of endings. This is one reason the phenomenon became so hard to correct. A scholar could explain that the long count cycle did not mean the end of existence, but another version of the myth would simply step sideways. Perhaps it was not physical destruction, but spiritual transformation. If transformation did not happen visibly, perhaps it happened invisibly. If nothing happened at all, perhaps humanity had misunderstood the vibration, or the date, or the nature of awakening. An elastic prophecy is difficult to disprove because it keeps changing its shape. Media helped that elasticity. Television specials loved the atmosphere. Ancient temples, dramatic music, rotating planets, slow shots of stone faces. The word Maya spoken as if it were itself a warning. The internet made the effect faster and stranger. One person's speculation could be copied, modified, exaggerated, and reposted until it no longer felt like speculation. It felt like something people were saying. And that phrase has always been one of rumor's favorite disguises. The story became especially powerful because it combined three things modern audiences find almost irresistible: ancient wisdom, hidden danger, and institutional distrust. Ancient wisdom offered authority. Hidden danger offered suspense. Institutional distrust offered protection against correction. If scientists said there was no rogue planet, believers could say scientists were hiding it. If archaeologists said the Maya did not predict the apocalypse, believers could say academics were too narrow-minded to understand the spiritual meaning. If governments denied disaster, denial itself became part of the plot. The myth could feed on every attempt to starve it. Yet it would be unfair to say everyone interested in 2012 was foolish. Many were not looking for destruction. They were looking for meaning. The modern world can feel spiritually thin, fast, commercial, fragmented, impatient, disconnected from sky and season. The Maya calendar, or at least the popular version of it, seemed to offer something older and more ordered. It suggested that time had depth, that history had pattern, that human life might be synchronized with something grander than work schedules and breaking news, that longing was real. But longing can still misread. The problem was not that people found Maya time fascinating. The problem was that the Maya were often made into mirrors. People saw in them whatever they already wanted. Proof of apocalypse, proof of awakening, proof that modern science was blind, proof that ancient peoples knew secrets we had forgotten. The actual Maya, historical, diverse, political, ritual, mathematical, living, were often buried beneath the projections. Commercial culture did the rest. Once a fear can be packaged, it rarely remains subtle. Books promised revelation. Documentaries promised forbidden knowledge. Films transformed the date into spectacle. Merchandise turned anxiety into a brand. Even mockery helped spread the myth, because joking about the end of the world still kept the date in circulation. A rumor does not always care whether you believe it. Sometimes it only needs you to repeat it. That is what happened with December 21st, 2012. It became a date people knew before they knew why they knew it. A cultural reference, a punchline, a private worry, a theme for parties, a subject for arguments, a way to sell survival gear or spiritual hope, depending on the customer. And through all of this, scholarship remained nearby, but quieter. The careful version required explanation. It required distinguishing between the long count and the calendar round, between period endings and final endings, between ancient evidence and modern interpretation, between Maya religion and imported fantasy. It required saying again and again that significance is not the same as apocalypse, but popular culture often does not reward that sentence. It rewards the cleaner fear. Here, we should notice something uncomfortable. The 2012 phenomenon was not only a misunderstanding of the ancient past, it was a case study in how modern culture manufactures mystery. First, take a real fragment of knowledge, then remove context. Add visual drama, invite speculation, ignore caveats. Repeat the simplified version until it becomes familiar. Then treat familiarity as evidence. By that process, a calendar cycle became a prophecy. The tragedy is that the real Maya achievement needed no exaggeration. Their calendars were astonishing without being apocalyptic. Their astronomy was impressive without needing to predict imaginary planets. Their concept of cyclical sacred time was profound without needing to serve as a self-help metaphor or disaster warning. But sensation often enters where humility should stand. The modern world did not invent the Maya calendar. It invented the panic around it. It took scholarly discoveries and passed them through fear, commerce, spiritual hunger, entertainment, and the Internet's talent for making uncertainty feel urgent. In doing so, it revealed less about the ancient Maya than about us. It revealed how eager we are to outsource our anxieties to the past. How willing we are to treat another culture's sacred systems as raw material for our own stories. How quickly mystery becomes merchandise. And how difficult it is, once a simple dramatic idea has entered public imagination, to replace it with something truer and more complicated. By the final months before December 2012, the date had become too famous to belong to evidence anymore. It had become an event before anything happened. And that is perhaps the strangest part. The apocalypse was experienced in advance. People feared it, joked about it, marketed it, denied it, prepared for it, and argued over it long before the day itself arrived. The world had not ended, but the story had already done its work. December 21st, 2012, arrived with the strange awkwardness of a prophecy meeting the morning news. The world did not end. There was no global earthquake tearing cities apart. No hidden planet appeared from behind the sun. No sudden reversal of the poles threw civilization into darkness. No cosmic switch flipped in a way that every living person could recognize. The sky remained ordinary, which may be the most humiliating thing a sky can do on the day it has been cast as the final actor in a planetary drama. People woke up. They went to work. They checked their phones. They made jokes. News anchors smiled with the relieved smugness of people who had never fully believed the story but had enjoyed covering it anyway. Online, some believers recalibrated. Some said the date had been misunderstood. Some shifted toward spiritual explanations. Others quietly moved on, leaving behind old posts, old predictions, and the faint embarrassment that follows a public certainty gone wrong. But the silence after a failed apocalypse is never truly silent. It asks what the noise was for. The easiest answer is that people were fooled. And yes, some were. Some accepted claims that had little evidence. Some trusted sensational books, misleading documentaries, or internet theories dressed in ancient clothing. Some confused astronomy with astrology, archaeology with rumor, and scholarship with conspiracy. But stopping there would miss the deeper story. The 2012 panic was not only about belief, it was about desire. Many people wanted the date to mean something, not always destruction, sometimes transformation, sometimes judgment, sometimes proof that reality had a hidden pattern, sometimes proof that modern life, with all its fluorescent speed and digital exhaustion, was not the whole story. The date offered a strange comfort. The idea that history was not drifting aimlessly, but moving toward a reveal. That word matters. Reveal. Apocalypse, in its older sense, is not only destruction. It is uncovering. It is the lifting of a veil. And while most people using the 2012 myth were not thinking in strict theological terms, the emotional pattern was similar. They wanted something hidden to become visible. They wanted uncertainty to end. They wanted the world to declare what kind of story it was. Modern life rarely does that. It produces crisis after crisis, but not always climax. Environmental damage unfolds slowly. Political distrust accumulates. Economic pressure tightens. Technology changes how people live before they have time to understand what changed. The future feels unstable, but not scheduled. There is no single day when the anxiety announces itself politely and becomes understandable. December 21st, 2012, gave that anxiety an appointment. That was part of its power. A date can discipline fear. It gathers scattered dread into one point on the calendar. Instead of worrying vaguely about everything, people can worry about one day. This is not rational in the strict sense, but it is human. Human beings have always tried to locate uncertainty in omens, anniversaries, eclipses, comets, numbers, prophecies, and thresholds. The specific myths change. The habit remains. So when the day passed uneventfully, the disappointment was not only comic. For some, it was emotional. If someone had believed in destruction, survival should have been pure relief. But failed prophecies often leave a residue more complicated than relief. They take away fear, yes, but also the imagined meaning fear had provided. The world continued. That was the problem. Because if no cosmic event arrived to explain the unease, then the unease belonged to us. No ancient calendar could be blamed for it. No hidden planet could carry it away. No sudden awakening could solve it by sunrise. The responsibility returned to human history, human society, human imagination. This is why failed apocalypses rarely disappear completely. They mutate. Believers reinterpret. Skeptics mock. Media moves on. But the underlying hunger remains available for the next date, the next sign, the next coded warning from the past or the sky. The apocalypse did not come in 2012 because the ancient Maya had not promised one, but the modern world had rehearsed one anyway. And rehearsal has consequences. For months, even years, the date had allowed people to practice emotions usually reserved for the end. Dread, wonder, fatalism, mockery, hope, confession, preparation. Some people bought supplies. Some traveled to places believed to have spiritual significance. Some made documentaries. Some built businesses around fear. Some gathered in communities of belief. Others laughed, but still participated by repeating the joke. The date became a cultural ritual, though not the kind the ancient Maya would have recognized. It was a ritual of projection. Instead of offerings to maintain cosmic balance, modern culture offered attention. Instead of carved monuments, it produced search results, headlines, films, and posts. Instead of kings legitimizing their rule through sacred cycles, media systems legitimized themselves through urgency. Everyone had something to gain from the date being interesting, even if almost no one wanted it to be true. And then, when nothing happened, the attention moved elsewhere. That movement says something uncomfortable about the way modern culture handles ancient history. The Maya calendar was useful while it could create suspense. Once the suspense failed, much of the public fascination evaporated. The deeper questions about Maya time, colonial destruction, living Maya communities, and the difference between cycle and doom were left for those willing to stay after the spectacle ended. But history often begins after spectacle fails. When the dramatic claim collapses, we can finally ask better questions. Not, why did the Maya get it wrong? They did not. Not, why did the world survive? That was never seriously in doubt from the evidence. The better question is, why did so many people accept a version of Maya knowledge that Maya evidence did not support? Part of the answer lies in distance. The farther away a culture seems, the easier it becomes to turn it into a screen. Ancient Egypt becomes curses and aliens. The Norse become helmets and apocalypse. The Maya become calendars and doom. Complexity is reduced to a symbol, and the symbol is asked to serve modern needs. Another part lies in our relationship with endings. We say we fear the end, but we are also drawn to it. Endings give shape to stories. A final day, however terrifying, is easier to imagine than an open future filled with slow consequences. Catastrophe can feel cleaner than responsibility. If the world ends, no one has to fix it. If the world continues, everything remains unfinished. December 22nd, 2012, was therefore the truly difficult date. Not because it was mysterious, but because it was ordinary. The ordinary world demands more than the apocalyptic one. It asks people to keep living with uncertainty, to repair what can be repaired, to understand the past without stealing from it, to stop treating ancient civilizations as fortune-tellers for modern fear, to notice that the failure of a prophecy can be an invitation to humility. The Maya did not owe the modern world an ending. What they left, in the surviving record, was far more interesting. An immense and intricate way of thinking about time, cycles, ritual, and renewal. The modern world turned that inheritance into a countdown, then acted surprised when the clock kept moving. The apocalypse that never came should have ended the myth. Instead, It exposed the myth's true subject, not the end of the world, the need to believe that the world has been secretly scheduled. The question was never really whether the Maya saw the end of the world. The better question is what kind of endings they understood. They understood that cycles turn, that power weakens, that rains can fail, that cities can grow too heavy for the landscapes beneath them, that rulers can speak the language of cosmic order while living inside political instability, that human beings depend on forces they do not control, and that forgetting this dependence can become dangerous. None of this requires a supernatural countdown. It requires attention. The modern 2012 story treated the Maya as if their greatest insight was a date. But their deeper insight was not that time would stop. It was that time returns with consequences. A cycle ending was not empty. It gathered memory. It asked for ceremony. It brought the past close to the present and reminded people that renewal is not automatic. That is a very different kind of warning. A doomsday prophecy says something will happen to you. A cyclical worldview says you are already participating in something, whether you understand it or not. This is where the Maya become most relevant, though not in the way the 2012 industry promised. They did not leave us a simple forecast of planetary destruction. But their systems of time preserve a way of thinking that modern culture often resists. They saw human life as embedded in patterns: celestial, agricultural, political, sacred, ecological. The sky was not separate from the field. The ruler was not separate from ritual. The present was not separate from deep memory. Modern people are not as different as we think. We also live inside cycles, though we often notice them only when they begin to hurt. Drought cycles, economic cycles, election cycles, news cycles, seasons of migration, planting, burning, flooding, disease, debt, violence, attention, forgetting. We like to imagine ourselves moving forward in a straight line. But much of life repeats, intensifies, returns under new names. The Maya did not need to predict a single final catastrophe to understand danger. They knew that instability can accumulate. That may be what the 2012 myth accidentally concealed. By focusing on one imaginary day of destruction, it distracted from the more serious idea that worlds can become unstable slowly through neglect, imbalance, and failed responsibility. A calendar turning does not end a society, but the things a society ignores while the calendar turns can. This is not to turn the Maya into modern environmental commentators. That would be another kind of projection. They were not writing for us, and we should resist making them sound like 21st century analysts in ceremonial dress. But we can still recognize that their worldview placed human beings inside relationships of obligation to gods, ancestors, fields, water, rulers, communities, and time itself. Obligation is not a fashionable word. It is heavier than inspiration, less marketable than awakening, more demanding than apocalypse. And yet, it may be closer to what Maya timekeeping implied. If a period ending arrived, the proper response was not passive fear. It was action, ritual action, political action, communal attention, the renewal of bonds. Time did not excuse people from responsibility. It intensified it. That is why the phrase, "what the Maya saw coming," must be handled carefully. They did not see our modern world in detail. They did not predict smartphones, disaster films, internet panic, or people arguing online about a calendar they barely understood. What they saw, through their own traditions, was that the universe is patterned but not effortless. Order must be maintained. Renewal must be enacted. Memory must be carried. Human arrogance is dangerous when it forgets the systems that sustain it. The evidence does not support the claim that the Maya announced a global apocalypse on December 21st, 2012. But the evidence does support something more subtle. The completion of cycles mattered. Sacred time required interpretation, and human beings were expected to respond to moments of transition with seriousness rather than spectacle. The tragedy of the 2012 panic is that seriousness was replaced with spectacle. Instead of asking what it means to live through the end of a cycle, the modern world asked whether something would explode. Instead of studying how a civilization linked time to responsibility, many people searched for clues about personal survival or spiritual promotion. Instead of listening to Maya concepts of renewal, they heard only the echo of their own fears. A culture obsessed with catastrophe may miss the quieter warnings. It may miss the warning that memory can be destroyed, that sacred systems can be commercialized, that living peoples can be made invisible beneath myths about their ancestors, that evidence can be stretched until it breaks, that an ending can arrive without fireworks in the form of erosion, forgetting, simplification, or indifference. The Maya did not need to predict the end of the world for their history to warn us. Their story warns us about interpretation. It warns us that fragments are not empty spaces for fantasy. It warns us that the past becomes dangerous when we use it only to decorate our anxieties. It warns us that calendars do not merely count days. They reveal what a society thinks days are for. To the ancient Maya, a date could hold ritual force. To the modern 2012 industry, a date became content. That difference says almost everything. If there is a lesson here, it is not that ancient peoples possessed secret knowledge that modern science has lost. It is that ancient peoples often asked different questions, not always better questions, not always gentler questions, but questions rooted in a world where time, nature, power, and the sacred were inseparable. The modern world tends to ask, how much time do we have? The Maya world often asked, what must be done at the proper time? One question encourages counting down. The other encourages participation. And maybe that is the real reversal. The 2012 panic imagined the Maya calendar as a clock ticking toward helplessness. But Maya sacred time was closer to a call for engagement. When cycles turned, people acted. They remembered, they offered, they legitimated, they renewed, they tried, however imperfectly, to keep the world in balance. That does not mean their world was harmonious. It was marked by war, hierarchy, sacrifice, environmental pressure, and political competition. We should not romanticize it. The Maya were human beings, not guardians of perfect wisdom. But neither were they cartoon prophets of doom. They were people who built elaborate systems to confront the instability of existence. And in that, they may have seen something clearly that we still struggle to accept. The world does not need to end all at once to be in danger. A society can misread its cycles. It can ignore signs of stress. It can confuse spectacle with understanding. It can treat sacred inheritance as entertainment. It can forget that renewal is work. So what did the Maya actually see coming? not the end of the world on one winter day in 2012. They saw that endings matter because they reveal whether a people know how to begin again. The Maya were never only a memory. This should be obvious, but it has to be said because so many modern stories about them begin in ruins and end in prophecy. The camera moves over temples. The music deepens. A narrator speaks of a vanished civilization. Then come the calendars, the gods, the warnings, the mystery. But outside that frame, Maya peoples continued to live. They lived through conquest, forced conversion, disease, labor demands, land loss, political violence, discrimination, and centuries of being described by outsiders as remnants of something past. They carried languages, community identities, agricultural knowledge, ritual practices, oral histories, weaving traditions, local calendars, saints with older shadows behind them, and memories that did not need stone monuments to remain real. To speak of the Maya as vanished is not only inaccurate, it is a kind of erasure. The living Maya world is diverse. There is no single Maya people in the simple sense. No one voice that can be made to stand for all communities across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, and diasporic spaces beyond. There are many Maya languages, many local histories, many forms of identity, many relationships to ancient heritage and modern life. Some communities maintain ritual practices with deep roots. Others live in cities, study in universities, organize politically, work across borders, create art, defend land, teach languages, and challenge the old habit of treating them as relics. This is where the 2012 story caused one of its quietest distortions. It made the Maya famous while often ignoring Maya people. The calendar became global, but living voices were frequently pushed aside by authors, filmmakers, spiritual entrepreneurs, and commentators who found it easier to speak about the Maya than to listen to them. Ancient symbols were used to sell fear, awakening, tourism, and mystery, while contemporary Maya communities were treated as background, if they appeared at all. That imbalance matters. A culture cannot be honored only by admiring its ruins. Ruins are powerful, but they are incomplete. They tell us about architecture, ritual, power, and memory. They do not replace living descendants. They do not speak every language still spoken. They do not carry every grief or every adaptation. They cannot explain what it means to inherit an ancient name while surviving modern poverty, racism, land conflict, migration, or political neglect. The living Maya remind us that history is not a sealed chamber. It continues. And continuation is rarely pure. Traditions change. Rituals adapt. Languages absorb pressure. Communities argue about identity, religion, politics, education, tourism, and the use of ancestral symbols. Some knowledge survives in altered form. Some is revived after suppression. Some is lost. Some is newly created from old materials. This does not make it less real. It makes it alive. A living culture is not a museum display. It breathes, negotiates, remembers selectively, forgets painfully, and sometimes reclaims what others tried to take away. This is important when we ask what an ancient calendar means now. For many outsiders, the Maya calendar became an exotic object, detached from the people whose ancestors developed and used it. But for Maya communities, questions of time, memory, and heritage are not merely academic. They are connected to language survival, ceremonial practice, education, land, dignity, and the right to tell their own history. The future of the ancient Maya world, then, is not hidden in a prophecy. It is visible in classrooms where children learn words their grandparents feared might be lost. It is visible in ceremonies held under pressure from modern religion or state suspicion. It is visible in archaeologists working with local communities rather than speaking over them. It is visible in activists defending land and water. It is visible in artists using ancient signs not as dead symbols, but as living inheritance. This does not mean every modern Maya person relates to the ancient past in the same way. That would be another simplification. Some may feel a strong, sacred connection to ancestral sites. Others may see them through tourism, politics, scholarship, or family memory. Some may practice Christianity, traditional religion, or blended forms shaped by centuries of colonial history. Identity is not a costume handed down unchanged. It is a field of choices made under historical pressure. But the existence of living Maya communities changes the ethics of the entire 2012 discussion. It means the ancient Maya cannot be treated as an ownerless mystery. Their calendars, myths, ruins, and books belong to histories that still have descendants. They belong to peoples who have been studied, romanticized, exploited, converted, displaced, photographed, marketed, and misunderstood. Any serious telling of the 2012 myth has to ask not only what the ancient evidence says, but who was silenced when the modern story was told. The answer is uncomfortable. The living Maya were often silenced by fascination with the dead Maya. Popular culture preferred the vanished prophet to the living neighbor. A vanished prophet can be made to say anything. A living person can disagree. A living community can object to distortion, challenge romantic fantasy, and remind outsiders that mystery should not become theft. This is why the phrase Maya prophecy must be handled with care. It can sound harmless, even respectful, but when used loosely, it can turn a diverse civilization and its descendants into a mystical brand. It can flatten scholarship, ignore colonial violence, and reduce living cultures to atmospheric evidence for someone else's spiritual drama. The real future of the Maya is not a secret date. It is survival with agency. It is the ongoing fight to preserve languages in a world that often rewards assimilation. It is the struggle to protect sacred places from neglect, looting, over-tourism, or development. It is the effort to teach younger generations that their history did not end with conquest, collapse, or a Hollywood apocalypse. It is the insistence that Maya people are not footnotes to their ancestors' monuments. They are part of the story's present tense. And this changes how we return to December 21st, 2012. That date came and went. The world did not end. But for many Maya communities, the more urgent issues were never cosmic destruction. They were land rights, language loss, poverty, political violence, cultural survival, and historical respect. The world was not ending in one spectacular moment. It was being contested every day in ways far less cinematic and far more real. There is a lesson in that contrast. The modern apocalypse story asked whether the sky would fall. The living Maya story asks whether memory can endure. It asks whether a people can survive being declared vanished. whether a culture can outlive the burning of its books, whether sacred time can remain meaningful after being turned into entertainment, whether descendants can reclaim the right to interpret their own past. The answer is not simple, but it is not hopeless. Maya languages are still spoken. Maya communities still exist. Maya intellectuals, artists, elders, activists, farmers, teachers, and spiritual guides continue to shape the meaning of their inheritance. The ancient world did not survive unchanged, because nothing living survives unchanged. But it did survive. That survival should humble the modern imagination. It should make us less eager to use ancient Maya knowledge as a mirror for our fears, and more willing to see the people who have carried Maya identity through centuries of pressure. It should remind us that the greatest mystery is not how a vanished civilization predicted our future. The greater mystery is how a wounded civilization refused to vanish. And perhaps that is where the future of this ancient world truly lies. Not in a countdown, not in a final warning, but in the continued act of remembering, spoken in many languages, lived in many communities, and still moving forward long after the world was supposed to end. In the end, the Maya did not give the modern world an apocalypse. The modern world brought the apocalypse with it. It arrived carrying its own fears, its own spiritual hunger, its own distrust, its own appetite for spectacle. It looked at an ancient calendar and saw a fuse. It looked at a cycle and saw a final sentence. It looked at a civilization of astronomers, scribes, builders, rulers, farmers, ritual specialists, survivors, and living descendants, and too often reduced them to messengers of doom. That is the real mystery of 2012. Not that the world failed to end. That was never the most likely reading of the evidence. The mystery is why the idea felt so believable to so many people, why a period ending became a global rumor, why fragments of stone were made to speak with false certainty, why lost books became empty spaces for fantasy, why a living culture was treated as if it existed mainly to decorate modern anxiety. The answer is uncomfortable because it points back at us. We are drawn to endings because endings give shape to fear. A final date is easier to imagine than slow responsibility. A cosmic disaster is cleaner than human confusion. If the world ends all at once, then history becomes simple. No more ambiguity, no more unfinished work, no more need to ask how societies damage themselves over time, how memory is destroyed, how evidence is distorted, how living peoples are made invisible beneath myths about their ancestors. But the world did not end. And because it did not end, the harder questions remained. What do we do with cycles we do not understand? How do we honor a past without making it serve our own fantasies? How do we read damaged evidence without turning every gap into a secret? How do we remember that ancient civilizations were not riddles left behind for us, but human worlds with their own politics, duties, fears, brilliance, and contradictions? The Maya calendar did not count down to nothing. It marked recurrence. It gave form to time. It held ceremonies, kingship, astronomy, memory, and sacred obligation inside a vast architecture of days. Its endings were not meaningless, but neither were they simple announcements of destruction. A cycle could close with seriousness, even danger, without implying that existence itself had reached the edge. That may be the lesson modern culture resisted most. Not every ending is annihilation. Some endings are thresholds. Some are reckonings. Some are invitations to repair what has been neglected. Some expose whether a people can remember properly, interpret carefully, and begin again without pretending the past exists only for entertainment. December 21st, 2012, became famous because people thought it might reveal the future. Instead, it revealed the present. It showed a world quick to confuse mystery with permission, quick to turn scholarship into sensation, quick to speak over the very people whose history it claimed to admire. Yet the story does not have to end in cynicism. Because after the panic faded, something more durable remained. The real Maya achievement. The calendars, the monuments, the surviving books, the creation stories, the mathematics, the ruined cities and the living communities, the languages still spoken, the memory wounded by conquest, but not erased. The insistence of a civilization that time is not empty and that human beings live inside patterns larger than themselves. That is far more powerful than a failed prophecy. The true secret was never that the Maya knew the date of the world's death. It was that they understood time as a living return, a force that binds the sky to the field, the ruler to the ritual, the past to the present, and endings to the possibility of renewal. The end was never the end. It was the moment the count turned over, and the world, still unfinished, asked to be read again.